Good evening. I'm Margaret Gardner and I'm chairing this session this evening, Universities Challenged. Let me begin by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. We're very fortunate for this event to have Professor Raimond Gaita, Professor Robert Manne and Professor Glyn to speak to us on a topic of such vital importance to our future. What do we expect from a 21st century university? What will this new millennium university be like? What ideals have survived? What happens when we change the way we talk about them? So, a little bit about the order of proceedings. Each speaker will speak in turn. And then at the end of their turn, I have asked each of them to ask the others a question or to make a comment. And from that will come the discussion among them that will precede then us moving to questions from the audience. So, to begin. In 1952, Sir John Cecil Masterman, author, sportsman, spymaster and academic, then Provost of Worcester College, Oxford, and subsequently Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University, published To Teach the Senator's Wisdom, or an Oxford guidebook. This book is a story of the writing of a guidebook by a group of Oxford dons to explain the essence of Oxford to a group of visiting senators from the United States. Part of the challenge about explaining this essence is drawn from Q, Arthur Quiller Coucher, in his poem Alma Mater. Know you her secret none can utter, hers of the book, the tripled crown. Know you her secret none discover, tell it when you go down. Cleverly, Masterman reveals through these Don stories about buildings, rituals, teachers, staff and students, the Don struggles to define and to debate the essence of their university, their attempts to produce what, in quotes, he calls a leisured book built on omissions and digressions. And this book was not to be an ordinary guide to the essence and the secret of Oxford, but rather a book that would act like, and again I quote, an enlightened and instructed friend, the man, with whom you can discuss the ideas that lie behind what you are seeing and the controversies and discussions which spring from those ideas, end quote. I expect we all hope this discussion tonight may have some of those qualities. So, to turn to the discussion, let me just say that Masterman quotes the accepted definition of a university from his time and place, a corporation of teachers or assemblage of colleges for teaching the higher branches of learning and having power to confer degrees. And if you check Wikipedia today, you'll get a similar definition with the addition that the word university is derived from the Latin Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium, which roughly means community of teachers and scholars. But when you go to the current Oxford English Dictionary definition of a university, in contrast it says it's a high-level educational institution in which students study for degrees and academic research is done. In the differences in these definitions, we find some of the ground for the discussion tonight. But let us turn to our distinguished speakers to set out that ground. And our first speaker, Professor Raimond Gaita, distinguished philosopher and author, professorial fellow in the Melbourne Law School and a Faculty of Arts, University of Melbourne, and emeritus professor of moral philosophy, King's College, London.
Thank you, Margaret. If you're wondering why I'm so suntan, it's because my wife and I have just returned from Queensland, where we were honoured to be invited to take part in the celebration of a great native title claim, successfully claimed. And so it's with my heart that we found it very moving. So it's with heartfelt sort of acknowledgement made to the traditional owners of this land and to their elders past and present. This takes about 15 minutes to outline, at least I read it to myself today. This evening's event has its origin in Rob's mixed feelings about a public lecture I gave last year in Adelaide. He suggested that we explore our differences in a public discussion, perhaps with Glyn, And later in the year, I gave a slightly different version of the lecture at the University of Melbourne, which Sully Heath kindly published in Meanjin. Glyn read the essay and wrote to me saying that he believed it's important to have a discussion such as these about universities, and I put Rob's suggestion to him, and here we all are. I'm grateful to Glyn for accepting my invitation and also for the Wheeler Centre for making the discussion possible. I'm also grateful to Margaret for agreeing to chair what will be a discussion, not as sometimes advertised, a debate, and one in which I hope she participates. Well, judging by the depressing stories that I often hear, I've been unusually lucky. From primary school to postgraduate study, and then as an academic, I've been taught by and worked with people who've inspired me. And in my writings about education, I've celebrated the fine, sometimes wonderful things they've revealed to me, and the conditions that made that possible. I'm a philosopher and not a social theorist, so that involved, for the most part, conceptual exploration of those conditions and what sustained them and what undermined them. And sometimes that required me to distinguish what I believe to be the real treasures from their false semblances, to distinguish enthusiasm, even passion, in teaching from love in teaching, passionate curiosity from a love of truth, the serious duties of professionalism from the joys and obligations of a vocation, deeper forms of intrinsic worth from less deep, even banal ones, for example. Because of the connection between what we can say and what we can think, I've often focused on what's creatively available and nourishing in our life with language and what's gone dead on us. And I might say here, perhaps in anticipation of the discussion later, that I'm not religious and so I don't believe in the resurrection of the body, but I'm a bit of an agnostic on the possibility of the resurrection of dead forms of speech. We'll see. What's now universally called higher education has changed radically in the last 30 years or so, and even more radical changes are in prospect. The most significant changes are the high increase in student numbers and the granting of the title university to institutions that have never thought of what they did under the concept of a university. At the time of the so-called Dawkins Revolution in the late 1980s, people still ask whether this or that was consistent with a serious concept of a university. But the concept that made people take such questions seriously, that enabled people to say, with a hope of being heard, that one can't justifiably call an institution a university if it doesn't have a department of philosophy or classics or physics, that concept is now dead. Indeed, I think it died long before Dawkins and probably was one of the important cultural facts that made his changes possible. The ghost of the concept lingers, however, which makes some academics uneasy. But it doesn't, I think, do us much good. It makes us talk about the importance of research without realising the degree to which the narrow conception of research that now dominates university life more often undermines than it nourishes the critically reflective life of academics, especially in the humanities. The present conditions of academic life too often undermine the critical distance from the times, from convention and fashion that the humanities require if they're to honour their obligation to the need almost everybody has at some point to understand what it means to live a human life. And the way we now think about and assess research diminishes the conception of teaching to which it's connected when people talk of the nexus between teaching and research, and diminishes even more the conception of teaching with which it's contrasted when people distinguish research active from teaching only staff. Many academics believe that things have gone badly wrong in the ways that universities assess research, and that this has had baleful consequences for teaching. I worry, though, that the current emphasis on learning with a capital L undermines the way we think about why a teacher's personal presence to her students matters. There's a tendency to think that a teacher's presence and her love of her subject is merely a psychological aid to learning something whose content could be described independently of her engagement with it and with her students. And I think this is false. The value of the life of the mind, what it can humanly mean, can only be revealed in the reflective appreciation of the way it deepens the lives of people who care for it. We don't have a sense of it independently of such exemplars. Indeed, I believe that's true of all value that goes deep. A teacher's love of her subject and her joy in teaching it can bring students to an entirely new understanding of the worth of their initiation into a subject and to one of the many but most nourishing forms of intrinsic worth. They may come to see it as something to which a life can be worthily devoted, and as the sacrifices of some academics living under tyranny reminds us, for which it may worthily be given. And we shouldn't forget that in our enthusiasm over online teaching, for example. When I spoke just now of a teacher's love of her subject and of her joy in teaching it, I really meant love rather than, say, enthusiasm. Even when enthusiasm is passionate, it'll be banal if it's directed towards things that are banal. Everyone knows, of course, that enthusiasm can be catching, so it's often regarded as a pedagogical asset, but it's neutral with respect to what it's about. Love, on the other hand, as Plato was perhaps the first great philosopher to see, is in complex ways related to the good. One can be an enthusiastic debunker, even an enthusiastic nihilist, but love asks to celebrate the beloved. Most importantly, love can be revelatory, and that's partly because we distinguish real love from its many false semblances by appeal to a range of critical concepts whose application secures a connection between love and truthfulness. At least as much as enthusiasm, love can of course energize students who are bored with their studies. More important than that, much more important than that in fact, is the fact that that love is an indispensable way to see the value of something. Often we see something as precious only in the light of someone's love for it. Most universities now protest that they're not ivory towers. An ivory tower is a term of denigration. It suggests a complacent, arrogant privilege and an irresponsible unworldliness. It's contrasted with the idea of university conscious of its duties to prepare students for the world. The belief that it's necessary to keep up with the times is now almost universal. Inevitably, of course, universities change with the times, and good thinkers in them always will find a voice suitable to each generation to realise and make fully living the deepest values of their disciplines. Each generation must appropriate in its own way even those truths about values that some people think to be universal, and speak them in its own voice. But changes that are self-consciously motivated by a desire to be up with the times are invariably modish. Students who self-consciously speak of their studies in the language of the times have learnt to speak no other, and have learnt to speak no other, are likely to be prisoners of their times and will not have the words with which to name and therefore to claim their inheritance. Sometimes, therefore, universities must resist their times if they're not to betray their students. In the finest essay I know on the subject, Hannah Arendt wrote of the complex relation to time, to past, present and future, that's required of both teachers and students. And I'll quote her. "Education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token to save it from the ruin which, except for the renewal, except for the coming of the new and the young, would be inevitable. And education, too, is where we decide whether we love our children enough, not to expel them from our world and to leave them to their own devices, not to strike from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something foreseen by no one, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing a common world." End of quote. In my essay in Meanjin, I argued that at least some universities should now regard it as their public duty to provide students, especially undergraduates, with a space that protects them from the pressures of the world, from pressure that conspires to make them children of their times. It's a space in which they're invited to form new desires and ideals in the light of values that they had probably never dreamed of and certainly never before fully understood. Universities that provide that honour an obligation to the young that Arendt identified when she said that we should try to ensure that we don't strike from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something foreseen by no one. If I'm right, then, our task is to see how much of the intimations of depth in our rhetoric of the intrinsic value of the scholarly and intellectual life, how much is honestly and lucidly accessible to us in living an authoritative speech. It's tempting to represent this as a task to discover what we really believe, or what we can honestly and consistently believe, after we've examined the conflicting intimations of our ways of speaking. But discovering whether we can strike a non-rhetorical note in our talk of the love of truth, for example, is not a matter of discovering whether we believe in the love of truth. It's more like coming to discover which of the concepts whose structures we can still abstractly articulate have life for us. It's more like finding which of admired ways of living are real options for us, without sentimentality, nostalgia, bathos, or some other form of inauthenticity. We must therefore ensure that the language of university administration and of research and teaching does not make us tone deaf. It's hubris, for example, to believe that one can keep an ironic distance from managerial newspeak and at the same time keep alive the language that can identify the treasures that we owe each generation of students. Well, some people will say that what I've said is high-minded, elitist nonsense, and other people will say that it's all very fine, but it's not practical. So I'll close by addressing those objections, the second explicitly, the first implicitly. The concept of the practical does not tell us what should matter to us. A practical person is one who seeks to find the means to realise and protect what matters most deeply to him or to her. Many of the things that seem most urgently practical to us cease to be so when misfortune strikes, and when we ask whether they, that is wealth or prestige and so on, really matter as much as we thought they did. Everybody knows that, but most of the time we know it only at the tops of our heads, in the way young people know that they're mortal. Most of the young people I know, my students, my children and their friends, believe that their generation and their children's generation are likely to be overwhelmed by conflicts arising from the shameful gap between the rich and the poor nations, compounded by ecological crises. I think they're right. Their generation and the generation after them will not be protected to the degree that mine has been from the terrors suffered by most of the peoples of the earth because of poverty, natural disaster, and the evils inflicted upon them by other human beings. More and more, I fear, knowledge of affliction and cruelty will test their understanding of what it means to share a common humanity with all the peoples of the earth, and to a degree almost too awful to imagine, their faith that the world is a good world, despite the suffering and the evil in it. What can sustain that faith? There are few questions that are more urgently practical and in need of sober realism in their formulation and answers. For academics, Arendt's answer is one of the best I know. The English philosopher R.F. Holland, whom I was fortunate enough to have as supervisor for my PhD, suggested a supplement to it. We should, he said, I quote now, concentrate on making available to those whom we teach the very best and most beautiful things that we know, and as far as possible, only those things. End of quote. Later in the same essay, after he had discussed the virtues of mind and character needed to master a discipline, or an academic subject, he said, and I quote, "In our officiation over the various levels of relative mastery, we are concerned as teachers with the conditions of a possibility which is still to be categorized in its deepest aspect. I shall now try to say what I most of all want to say about it. It's the possibility of coming into an inheritance. It has to do with no less a question than whether a person can be at home in the world, whether he can find it a good world despite the ill, by being brought into contact with forms of understanding and apprehension in which some good is to be encountered, some wonder to be seen, whether in nature or the works of human beings. A person might be helped to see the beauty of reality, helped to live more fully, helped to be glad that he's alive. The expression knocking at my mind is nourishment of the soul." End of quote. And in anticipation of our discussion later on, I just emphasise here being brought into contact with forms of understanding in which some good is encountered, some wonder to be seen, whether in nature or the works of human beings. Okay, well, love is the natural and right name to give to our attention to such things in one's life, and the desire that's natural to human beings to share them. Its existence in one person can awaken it in another, and universities, I think, can do nothing finer for their students than to create and protect the conditions that enable that to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Now Professor Robert Manne, who's a distinguished political scientist and public intellectual, and unless he dislikes that term, who's a professor of politics at La Trobe University.
It's what Ray said is true, that in a way this occasion came after Ray gave a longer but similar lecture in Adelaide a little while ago, and I was chairing it, so I couldn't say anything. But I wanted to say, and I'd probably, if I was going to give a name to the talk I'm now about to give, I would say yes, but. And I speak here not as an expert on universities, and in a way I've spent very little time in administration of universities at all, to a shocking degree, but I do speak as someone who has been a very dedicated, I think, university teacher, and for almost 40 years. It's a shocking admission. So this is a sort of footnote to what Ray says, and I'll call it yes, but. Before the Second World War, a very small minority of the population in Western societies, predominantly men, predominantly from the social elite, went to these things we call universities. From the late 1950s, that changed, with a progressively larger number of people on the basis of a growing movement towards gender equality now attending universities. Even though there was talk about the value of liberal education and the virtues of a more highly educated population, it is probably true, as the late Eric Hobsbawm, a week ago, argued in his masterwork, Age of Extremes, that the central reason for the post-50s growth in universities was the need to train the upper echelons of the administrative and teaching workforce of what was becoming an increasingly sophisticated manufacturing and service economy. In the absence, and I'm continuing with Hobsbawm's argument, in the absence of any alternative site of training, universities, the principal existing institutions of higher education, willy-nilly filled that need. In Western societies, universities moved in half a century from elite institutions, where typically far less than 1% of the population spent their late adolescence or early adulthood, to mass institutions, where eventually 30 or even 40% did. Hobsbawm regarded this change as so dramatic and significant that he analysed it in some detail in his chapters dealing with what he calls the most consequential transformation in human history, and he meant the most consequential transformation in human history, the post-war economic and social revolution of capitalism's, what he called and others have called, golden age, the period between 1950 roughly and the mid-1970s. Now, I'm retiring this year from the humanities faculty of one of the many new universities created in this period of expansion. Although, unlike Hobsbawm's explanation, the one I am retiring from was created originally to teach nothing but the core disciplines in the Western tradition, the sciences, the social sciences, mathematics, humanities. It's now also teaching old professions like law, and the new skills required in a modern, sophisticated service economy: information technology, health sciences, business management, tourism, and so on. I'm also retiring at a time when several attractive aspects of the older conception of the university I encountered as an undergraduate in the 1960s no longer, often for sound reasons, cut much ice. The idea of lifelong academic tenure, whose sole purpose, as I understood it, was to guarantee academic freedom, has gradually vanished. In mass, hybrid, often partly vocational training institutions, lifelong tenure actually, I think now, makes little sense. Hardly anyone, for that matter, still remembers what was once meant by the idea of academic freedom. Academics are expected not to criticise their own institutions, much as people working in a corporation are expected not to criticise that corporation. No one today, in addition, would be greatly surprised if an academic was reprimanded or even threatened with dismissal for expressing an outlandish opinion. I won't say. No one any longer expects or even pretends that in a system where more than 30% of adolescents or young adults attending what are still essentially taxpayer-funded institutions, particularly the younger institutions are taxpayer-funded essentially, no one expects that universities can exercise autonomy from the state in any meaningful sense, or that they need not be responsive to the demands of their paymasters, as they are almost on a daily basis. No one any longer seriously expects academics to administer the university, except at the margins, let alone that crucial decisions will be taken by processes plausibly described as collegial. While academics are still expected to teach, no one seriously thinks that teaching will be accorded the kind of respect given to research. What I've sketched out and what's changed is what I've seen changed, and in a way it was the old pattern of the university that really attracted me to it many years ago. In all these ways, the old conception of the university, as I experienced it as an undergraduate at the University of Melbourne in the mid to late 1960s, is dying or is dead. One may regret its passing, as I do in very many ways, and quite deeply, but minimal realism forces one to accept, in my view, that such a concept will not come back. The one old idea, however, that still has life in it is the one that suggests that there still exists at the university a kind of virtual community of scholars and students who are involved in the pursuit and the transmission of truth, and who understand that one vital part of the university's purpose is for the scholars to educate a self-chosen segment of each new generation of students in one of the core Western academic disciplines: the sciences, mathematics, humanities, the social sciences. No one ought seriously, in my view, to think that in a system where the distinction between universities and colleges of advanced education have been eroded, as they have been in Australia since the Dawkins reforms, which in my view Ray is right to think is more a symptom than a cause, no one should think that such tasks are all that the university will do. No one who researches and teaches in these core disciplines ought even any longer, in my view, to think that they are at the centre of the university and that the schools of professional or technical training are only on the periphery. No one ought seriously to argue that initiation into the core disciplines of the Western tradition can or indeed ought to be the choice for most of the more than 30% of adolescents or adults who attend one or another university, as they are often as they're called, institutions of higher education, as if there was no difference. The majority of these people to prepare themselves to take their part in the upper echelons of the professional or technical workforce. And yet, and this is why I want to say yes but, because this is the yes part, Yet equally, no one should deny that one of the fundamental purposes of the contemporary university is to educate a part of each new generation, to introduce it to the life of the mind, and to acquaint it with the disciplines of the sciences and humanities that have proven their capacity over time in the search for knowledge and understanding and the rigorous pursuit of truth. Once what part of each new generation was initiated into one or another of the core disciplines was decided on the basis of privilege, of class and gender. Thank God that era has passed. Now it is, and certainly in my opinion ought to be, decided on the basis rather of disposition, of talent, of eagerness, of inborn or awakened intellectual appetite, hunger. Teaching at a university for almost 40 years has convinced me, in some ways it is the main reason I was keen to talk tonight and to help be a part of this evening's meeting, has convinced me that there exists a minority in each new cohort of students who are drawn instinctively to the most traditional purposes of the university, whose interest in one or another of the traditional disciplines can be awakened by teaching that opens eyes to the beauty and power of philosophy or physics or mathematics or history or literature or whatever, but the whatever is not endless and is not coterminous with what happens at a university. That there is a part of each generation who will soon discover, often to their own surprise, that they have come to university not only or even primarily to earn a professional qualification to equip them for the workforce, but to take part in the search for knowledge and understanding and to experience the life of the mind. Now, there are various ways in which this purpose can be fulfilled by the university. In the older of the Australian universities, it is possible, as Melbourne University has done, to follow the example of the Ivy League universities in the United States and to require students to take a first generalist degree in the sciences, mathematics, humanities, and so on, before specialising in a professional or vocational postgraduate degree. And one of the reasons I was so pleased that Glyn Davis agreed to be here tonight is that he has been the pioneer of this possibility. In new universities, like the one I've taught at, this is not practical, I think. Practical is a word that I don't always dislike, but sometimes I don't like it. It depends the context a bit. What is, however, possible here is in the kind of university in which I teach at La Trobe is a differentiated offering where students in the same institution can choose either to move from high school straight into a preparation for professional or technical employment, or can delay their preparation for participation in the workforce by spending 3 or 4 years studying in one or another of the disciplines for what we call its own sake. And it's this group of students that I have had the privilege really of teaching over this period and have made great efforts to have subjects which will attract them, but which will also have some influence on their lives, I hope, in the long term. There is, however, a paradox in the way the traditional disciplines are offered at Melbourne and La Trobe. At Melbourne, students are required, as I've said, to study for a generalist degree, and at La Trobe, it's only one option among many. On the other hand, at Melbourne, face-to-face teaching of students that the students will experience as undergraduates will as likely as not be delivered by postgraduate students, by what the Americans call teaching assistants, as now happens in the Ivy League universities. At universities like La Trobe, those studying generalist degrees will most likely from time to time be taught to face by the permanent academic staff, as they would be in one of the splendid American liberal arts colleges. Increasingly, in the old elite universities in Australia, which are dominated by what I'll call the research outcomes culture, so far as possible, undergraduate face-to-face teaching is avoided, not lecturing, but what we used to call tutorials. as such face-to-face teaching is in the best universities in the States. In the newer universities, students are much more likely to experience, because it is not able to be avoided there, the kind of teaching that the older universities once offered their undergraduates. That, to our eternal gratitude, Ray and I experienced, and I believe from having read Glyn on Donald Horne that he also experienced in his undergraduate days. An experience that we learned was utterly central to what we thought to be a university and what we called the university experience. That the kind of experience of the teacher-student relationship once routinely offered by a university education is now more readily available in the newer hybrid universities than in the older ones is a paradox, it seems to me, of some significance in thinking about the kind of challenges that contemporary universities in Australia now face. I'm genuinely hopeful that we can get somewhere in the discussion tonight. To advance our discussions, I have one question for Glyn and one for Ray, so I'm going to do what I meant to do, but can I do it now, because it seems to me the way to end my talk. To Glyn, I would ask whether the student-teacher relationship we all, I believe, once experienced as undergraduates is still possible in an academic community which believes and is rewarded on the basis of research as a far more important thing than teaching. And to Ray, I would ask, how can his conception of the university as a community of scholars opening the eyes of new generations to the beauty that is found in philosophy, physics or literature, how can that be reconciled with the present social reality of 30 to 40% of young people going to places like universities, many of whom go for good reason in the hope of gaining qualifications? Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And our final speaker, Professor Glyn Davis, AC, Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Melbourne and Professor of Political Science at that university, as well, a distinguished author on public policy and higher education.
Thank you, Margaret and Ray and Robert. It's been a great privilege in recent weeks to read Ray's essay, to enjoy his lilting, uplifting article in The Age on Tuesday, and to hear his reflections tonight. And I'm gratified those reflections have provoked such interesting thoughts from Robert and clearly a large and enthusiastic audience. Ray offers an almost poetic image of the ideal university, a place I know Robert and I would dearly like to be at. A university apart from the world, unhurried by other concerns, devoted to reflection and learning. Now, there's so much richness in the essay that forms the basis of tonight's discussion. The risk is that we're going to talk past each other, and I suspect we managed to do that at lunch recently. So I'm going to sort of take one core proposition advanced by Ray, his contention that we've lost the essential concept of the university. As Ray argues, as Robert just echoed, his ideal university is dead. And Ray opens a longer piece that he's written with a telling question about whether a university without a department of philosophy is really a university at all. Now, strictly applied, therefore, Australia has very few universities. Only 10 of the 39 public universities in this country have a department of philosophy, though many others, of course, have programs that employ individual philosophers or offer strands of philosophy. Now, this may suggest, I think, two things. One is the idea that Australia may have invented a novel form of institution where people obtain degrees but don't have access to the personal and intellectual transformation that is elsewhere associated with university education, a sort of university light. Alternatively, and I guess I want to suggest, the Australian experience refutes the idea of a single model, a single concept of the university. John Henry Newman may have called his book The Idea of a University, but we should treat it and him with considerable caution. It is possible to construct a university without philosophy, even without humanities, and still imagine it fulfilling the mission of great teaching, of imparting knowledge, of encouraging wisdom, of building in students skills of critical thinking. Now, it may not look like a university that any of us would like to be at, But look around Australia and you can see competing visions for what higher education might be like. I'm very conscious that on the stage here we have two humanities scholars and two social scientists. So we've got to be a bit careful about defining the university in our own image. There are clearly vast domains of human knowledge missing from the panel. In his presentation, Ray described his own education at the University of Melbourne in the 1960s and very generously described an experience he shared with Robert, and both noted the great teaching at the core that made it a wonderful experience. And they're describing in many ways a legendary period with some key Australian intellectuals devoted to their students, keen to share ideas in and beyond the classroom. And clearly much has changed as universities have grown, but not everything. I'll come back to that. For example, although often it's said that people have now gone to professional degrees and they're missing out on the arts and humanities and sciences, in fact, the number of Australians studying professional qualifications has always been a majority. In the early 1960s, when Ray was at university, 2/3 of the students on campus then were enrolled in a professional degree. And 2/3 is exactly the same percentage in 2012 as are enrolled in professional degrees across Australia. Student preferences haven't changed in more than half a century. In fact, the taste for reflection, characterised best by the humanities, has always been a minority preference for students, right back to the first students who enrolled in an Australian university 160 years ago. The patterns have been astonishingly consistent. Most students, as Robert and Ray both acknowledged, do prefer a professional degree. Now, I don't think any of us here would say that makes them any less committed to their studies or to their ideal of what higher education should be like. And as Ray was careful to point out, there's knowledge and wonder aplenty in the professional disciplines, opportunities to interrogate the wider world through the prism of medicine or law or engineering. Each of these disciplines has developed its own mode of thinking, a way of seeing that, like the humanities, interrogates and imparts as a university education. The idea that knowledge has distinct domains and separates us has a long history, and most famously in the essay which Ray mentions in his writing, C.P. Snow's notion of the two cultures, which is drawn from a lecture he gave at the Senate House in Cambridge in 1959. Snow observed that many in the humanities distrust those in the sciences as somehow lacking reflectiveness, while those in the sciences suspect the humanities of lacking intellectual rigour. Now, Snow was both a physicist and a novelist. He was in both worlds and he had lots of friends in both worlds, and he observed that these friends could like him, but they couldn't understand each other. They lived in the same suburbs, they may as well lived in different countries. And that led Snow to conclude that the essential task of a university was to embrace both cultures, to create meaningful contact across these two worlds. And he was a really powerful plea, and a very early plea, for interdisciplinarity, as not just as desirable, but as the core characteristic of contemporary learning, which is quite a different vision from what learning is about from an earlier model. And this vision of multidisciplinary as a core concept for organising universities influenced many of the universities created in Australia in the 1960s and the 1970s, including La Trobe, where Robert has been a distinguished intellectual leader for 40 years, and Griffith, where I worked for nearly 2 decades. Some, like La Trobe, included philosophy programs in their profile, but others, like Griffith, did not, and neither of these institutions look anything like Melbourne or Cambridge. These institutions have been central to the most important change to Australian higher education since the 1960s, the democratic project that has seen participation in higher learning rise from just 3% of the population in 1970 to 35% today. If, as Ray says, knowledge nourishes the soul, then the expansion of university education has opened opportunities to millions. It has been crucial. It's just hard to register the change in scale. There are now there were 30,000 higher education students across the whole of Australia in 1950. There are now nearly 1 million Australians and another 300,000 international students studying in our universities. Universities have become a central part of the community in a way they couldn't have been in earlier generations. And I think this goes to Ray's powerful quote from Hannah Arendt. As her own experience showed, Arendt knew that education is the chance in a young life to undertake something new, something unforeseen by no one, to prepare them for the task of renewing a common world. This is precisely why the expansion of enrolments is so exciting, not as a financial prospect, but as a deeply human one. And Ray, of course, recognises that we might want competing visions of a university, and he talks in his paper about the public duty for at least some universities to provide undergraduate students with space that protects them from the pressure of the world, from the pressure to conform to their times. And some students, as Robert observed, are instinctively excited by that opportunity, and they need institutions and programs that reflect this mission. It's a core part of universities. But our history tells us as well that many others will seek a more vocational outcome, and they too deserve a congenial place to prepare them for the task of renewing a common world. There must be room for both, room for institutions that offer traditional immersion in the humanities and fundamental sciences, room for those with a different mission around bringing together disciplines to encourage new knowledge. I started by fretting about the risk of talking across each other rather than shared concerns, and observed before we started that we had to work hard to find points of difference, but we would. A philosopher talks movingly of ideals. He evokes a world worth our ambitions. A university administrator, with a sigh, acknowledges that all human institutions, including universities, disappoint. Even with the highest aspirations, things fall short. We remember Kant's injunction, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever done.
Thank you, Glyn. I'm now going to hand over to Ray, who has the first chance at question or comment to his panel members.
On the one hand, I want to say I think there has to be radical social change if anything like what Rob and I and Glyn think really valuable in. It's not the only thing that we value, but the kinds of things that I've wanted to celebrate can be achieved. I'm, for example, sceptical of the claim that so many young people for so long need to go to institutions of education. I'm still, to some degree, attracted to an idea that Ivan Illich put forward in the 1960s, where he said the hidden curriculum of schooling is that you can't learn anything unless it's from a teacher or an institution of education. And that's one thing, and it's an idea that I would explore in some sort of ways. And I'm also one reason that was offered as a justification, even if it wasn't the cause for the Dawkins reforms, was that it wanted to break down the elitist nature of the education system. And that was all. That, in a way, that was a foolish fantasy, because the distinctions that he wanted to break down reasserted themselves indeed with a vengeance, and without a concept of the university, as it were, to curb some of the more baleful consequences of that reassertions. And that could have been predicted right at the beginning, it seems to me. But I've also always felt that the deep need to break down in society the ways in which human beings look down upon one another. It's generally been a mistake to try to do this by reforming the educational institutions, because let me put it this way, a bit hyperbolically, the Dawkins reforms didn't produced the result that more people went to university. It produced the result that nobody went to university because the concept of university became defunct. And we all became members of higher institutions, institutions of higher education of one kind or another. So, on the other hand, that is when I think on the one hand there has to be radical change, on the other I think there needn't be. I'll just give a couple of simple examples. Last year I attended a conference in the honour of, I shouldn't be so coy, it was in honour of me. But it was really, I was going to say, but what was interesting about it was that it was attended by very different kinds of people, by philosophers. It was an international conference, by philosophers, by social theorists, by political theorists, by people from the law faculty, and then from people also within universities in literature, but outside of universities as novelists and playwrights and poets. And of course, I can't be an objective judge, but a lot of people said the papers were of a high standard. And one of the very distinguished international lawyers there said it was the reason it reminded him that it was the reason he became an academic. Now, the person who organised the conference, of course, had to put a lot of energy into it, and it cost the university quite a bit. But his colleagues in his department chided him, and with considerable resentment, some of them, for wasting his time on that when he could have perhaps spent the time writing for an A-grade journal, which would have done his department some good, whereas the conference did him no good. It did the department no good. Now, I think that's a ridiculous state of affairs, but it doesn't seem to me there has to be much change, as it were, radical change for universities to realise that there's a conception of research building or research assessment that's gone a bit crazy if it delivers a result like that. I also know from my own teaching, and I'll stop at that, my own teaching in London, because I haven't taught much, I haven't taught in Australia at all, except for last year at Melbourne, and which I think was terrific, actually. And I ought to say, I think when we're talking about vocational institutions, the law school of which I'm now part is intellectually incredibly dynamic. So, I started teaching in London in 1977 and stopped only a year and a half ago, and I felt the teaching of philosophy there hadn't really changed. I get the students, we talk about Descartes or Plato or whatever it is, and I don't notice much difference, to tell you the truth. And what I find interesting is that those students, over 95% of them, are doing only philosophy without any other combinations. I don't think that's a particularly good thing, but for some reason or other, King's doesn't offer the classical combinations of philosophy and literature and philosophy and history. And for very strange, and they're passionate about it. Because I'm not there often, I can't get administrative duties, but ironically, I was put in charge of careers. And the people who are organising this in the university are incredibly keen that the students should come to find out what's available to them as career. But they could never drum up an audience. Finally, they said, will you arrange a screening of the film of Romulus, my father? At the same time as the careers talk, we might get some students along. So that's possible. And I don't see why that sort of thing isn't possible in any university. So as I say, on the one hand, I think in some respects there needs to be radical social change, especially to put a stop to all the worries about elitism. When I've defended this idea of the university, I'm often called elitist. And I often really resent it because, as some of you may know, I wrote a book celebrating a man, my father, in Romulus, my father, who had 4 years of primary education. All his life read only the Sun newspaper. That was before Bolt. One of his dear friends helped raise me, and I've, in a more recent book after Romulus, I've constantly acknowledged my gratitude for what they taught me. And so I've never had a sense that a life different from the intellectual life I've celebrated, is any less worthy. I mean, this always struck me as a repugnant idea.
Response.
Well, I had my questions.
Well,
No,
sorry.
wait on. I'll reformulate them. I mean, the reason that I'm interested in being here and in this topic is that I do think there is a possibility of holding on to something if we don't allow it to go. And I suppose my key conception is that universities are now hybrid and they do many different things, and I don't disagree at all with Glyn saying that they've always played a very big role in professional education, and they've widened that to have things that once, I know at Melbourne they wouldn't have taught, and I don't wish to change any of that and so on. What I do really take seriously is the idea of holding on to what I call this virtual university within the university, which will be the way of the traditions continuing, and those are traditions that I was nourished by as a student, and those that I've dedicated my life as a teacher to try and continue with each new generation of students. And it seems to me that with regard to that, those are the two questions I want to ask. I think Ray's language will not get anywhere, and I think it should get somewhere, if he doesn't find a way of talking plainly about the fact that if you have 30 or 40% of young people going to these things we call universities, most of them will not be able to, want to, or not to be involved in this virtual university. And I think it's very important that somehow the discussion of the university takes place in the full acknowledgement of that and the non-condescending acknowledgement of that. And non-condescension is very much at the centre of Ray's own thinking, as he's just said, not only to do with his father and so on, but to do with his philosophical writing. But I do think you need to find a language in which this is all fully acknowledged. And Glyn, to you, the tough question is the question about teaching. The experience that I had, and I wouldn't be at all surprised that you had as an undergraduate, is based on the fact that academics didn't think that their research was the be-all and end-all, that they thought there were two things, even in my case three things, because there's also public engagement, but at least two things that they all had to take seriously. And I don't believe lecturing is a fundamental form of teaching. I think sitting around with a group of students hundreds of years or even longer is the way in which our tradition communicates an understanding of what really has been established within the frames of disciplines. Yeah. And I think, I just think that there is a real danger at the elite universities in Australia that academics will retreat to seeing teaching as something to be done hurriedly and as a second-rate activity, and that the research is where the eros and their lustre now rests. And I think that will be a terrible loss if that can't in some way be changed. And I think the real thinking about universities ought to be how to, as it were, stop that trajectory. So those are the two questions, or sort of made into statements.
Okay. If I may, I think the danger you point to is real and present, and Ray's example of someone being criticised for organising a Festschrift for him because that's an A-Star Journal article that didn't happen is there. It is embodied. There's the danger expressed. I'm very pleased they persisted though, Ray, because it's a great thing to have done. But my caution is this. Like you, I had some of that experience as an undergraduate. I also remember long stretches of immensely bad teaching, as every student does. You remember the great teachers and the people who inspired you, and you put carefully out of mind the rest, and that's as it should be. But an experience that, Ray described going to the UK. In my case, it was going to the United States. You have to see your own system from outside often to get a sense of how it fits. So Margaret and I went in 1987, 88 to the United States, and as postdocs, and I went to Berkeley, and we both went to Berkeley first, and I decided to sit in on some doctoral classes. I thought this would just be interesting. I've heard about this stuff in America. I had the traditional Australian pathway, arts degree, honours, straight from honours into PhD, out at 25 and into the academic workforce with a PhD, and encountered in these doctoral classes people in their late 20s who are just starting their PhD because it had taken that long to do the course. And what I drew from the classes in Berkeley was frank astonishment at how good they were, great remorse at what they knew that I didn't, and a strong sense that the quality of the education being provided to the students was just so vastly superior to anything that I'd ever encountered. And Berkeley was and is one of the world's great research universities, and these classes were taught by world-famous political scientists in their core areas in classes of 5 and 10. So
Doing doctorates?
No, but they were also teaching master's students, and in some cases, because I went to the Liberal Arts College, they were then doing the same thing in the Liberal Arts College. I make the point only to say it doesn't follow necessarily that a great research university will end up as a bad teaching institution, but it's a hell of a risk, and you're right to point to the danger, and Ray's given us a vivid example that it happens.
No, I'm not against research at all. What I'm against is what's becoming a very narrow conception of it, and in the UK for a long time, for example, the form of assessment for a department was that one would submit the best, what one thought to be the best that one had written in the last, I think it was 4 years. And that was then read by a panel of people in the discipline. And what was important about it, in theory at least, it didn't matter if you published it in the Sun newspaper. They were required to read it for what it was worth and make an assessment. Of course, that's a very expensive system. And one thinks there must be, and that's going there too, and because it's so expensive, and one thinks there must be some other way, objectively, of assessing what someone's worth, and by peer review, and then of course it's going to be A-grade journals, and then whether you publish with Oxford or Cambridge or something like that. And on the face of it, that looks eminently sensible, because I think, and this is connected to Rob's point, you can't possibly have so much money being spent on universities without them being accountable in some way. The difficulty is in finding a form of accountability that in a way doesn't undermine what's best. And what I think is happening at the moment is that the current form of assessment encourages a kind of conformity and undermines a kind of reflectiveness that is fundamental to questioning the basis in the discipline. And I say this even in philosophy, which I think prides itself on being reflective about its nature, but increasingly isn't. And so I think so I'm all in favour of research, but provided it's research, we may have to pay for the conditions under which research, what we call research active staff, are also critical, have the time to muse and to meditate, and therefore to be critically reflective about the assumptions in their discipline. Otherwise, it becomes a kind of high-flying thoughtlessness, really. And trying to address Rob's point, I'm just not sure what to say. And in fact, I was hoping tonight would be a way of raising this. I'm struck by the fact that the proportion of the people really interested in the kinds of things that you and I are interested in is much the same as it was when we were students. I think when we were at Melbourne, there were roughly 15,000 students, and I would reckon that the number engaged who were really active in the clubs and societies, etc., and wrote for Farrago and all that, will probably be no more than 500. And so when you speak of the possibility of a virtual university within the university, I think that's right. I've never ever thought that the majority of students in the university would be interested particularly in what I've been celebrating. I have thought, and I now agree with you, that this is wrong. I have thought that that there would be a cluster of disciplines that would define the nature of the universities, whereas your claim is that where the universities now are essentially hybrid institutions, and I accept that fully.
I think that there might be a restless audience out there who are ready to ask a question or two.
So don't storm the stage.
Yes. Now, and I emphasise question or two. I just make a point of politeness. That's never a good look when your question is actually a comment and takes longer than the speakers had to speak. And know that if I perceive this, I will be inclined to be impolite. So, on that note, questions. Please.
George Powell, excuse me for having a poor voice. I've had a virus chest infection. I've nearly lost my vocal cords. You wouldn't have thought I was an opera singer once. I've been most interested in tonight, and particularly the word love and the definitions of it. But what does it really mean in a world that's based on standards and maintaining standards? To me, from my life experience, which started in the bush in Gippsland with old men, and my readings and research and education, I made the view that it was of three things: virtuous, vital, and vigorous engagement. I've pondered over the way in which we've been addressed tonight, for I ponder about my university education and research, for I wonder where that has gone in the way we educate our young to pursue life as being vital, vigorous, and virtuous. Comment, but I leave it as a question.
Panel.
Well, I think it was a comment, and an interesting comment, but it's, because it's a comment, it's open-ended, and I think I would like some hard questions.
Given the accelerated pace of socio-technological change, particularly in the area of genetic engineering, for example, surely the classical notion of philosophia, or love of wisdom, and a wise and self-reflexivity is just as relevant, if not more relevant today than ever before.
Sounds like a question to a philosopher.
Well, yeah, it is, and because again, I'm in two minds about something. Glyn said that we could have a university even without a humanities department, let alone without a philosophy department. And on the one hand, I want to say no to that because I want to stress the importance of the humanities in reflecting about what it means that science has delivered this or delivered that. In my own discipline, I'm very interested in evolutionary theory and its relevance to moral psychology. But it seems to me, in the end, it has to be philosophy, that not only philosophy, but empirical psychology of a substantive sort that assesses the developments of those things. But it is also true that there. Iris Murdoch once made a wonderful remark. She said, we have to be true to Socrates and to the virtuous peasant. And a virtuous peasant now maybe sounds a slightly condescending expression. But the reason I invoked my father was partly because I could see how in his relation to his work, he was a blacksmith, and this connects a little bit with the question about virtue and so on, how that was connected with his whole orientation to the world. And so it can't possibly be true that only a reflective life of a kind that can be engendered in a university is the only form of life that is aimed to live reasonably clear-sightedly. Because I take it the virtuous peasant still wants to know whether what he or she feels really is love as opposed to infatuation, whether it really is humility as opposed to servility, etc. And there are many, many, many forms of living in which those questions arise, not just the academic.
Yes, good evening. Thanks very much to the Wheeler Centre and the participants tonight for a great discussion. There's a quote that I've heard that the opposite of diversity nowadays is university. And there's probably a view that academia is generally a bit left-wing, or more than a bit left-wing. A couple of questions directly to Ray and to Robert. I believe the Melbourne Law School, 130 of the academics from Melbourne Law School recently subscribed to an open letter criticising the treatment of a former student of the law school in relation to the setting up of a slush fund for a boyfriend that the boyfriend then used to rip off $500,000. The academics seem to see no wrong in that at all. Perhaps you could comment on that. And Robert, I attended a La Trobe University session last year about refugee policy. David Manne and David Collett were speaking, so it wasn't a kaleidoscope of views. And I approached you later to thank you for organising it and asked and suggested that it might have been nice if there had been an alternate view. I don't know if you would care to repeat what you told me in response to that?
I can't remember.
You told me if I wanted an alternative view, I could go somewhere else, and you used a term that I won't repeat. But look, all I expect from institutions, and I actually pointed to the sign and said, this is La Trobe University, why not a robust exchange of views and alternative views? So could I get a comment from Ray and Rob?
Well, I can't comment on the law school because I don't know about it, and I've been in the law school only for a year or so, and anyway, also in the arts faculty, and so I can't comment on that. But I do know that it's an intellectually incredibly vigorous department. But I think what you're getting at is that the charge that university-educated people very often constitute what's called the chattering classes, which is not a flattering expression. I mean, there's some truth in that, and I think, but the truth is distorted in the poisonous inanities of the culture wars, and so it's not something I want to take on here. But I've always been suspicious of the idea that in order to think clearly, you need to go to a university or a higher education institute, and that indeed it's true. You go to a party, and there are embarrassingly similar opinions constantly being expressed. I think that's true.
Can I say something? I just wanted to say about the question of diversity. And there are some students, I think, in this room, and many of my students who couldn't make it. It has been important to me for 40 years that never will a student feel that they can't express their honest opinion about anything, and I hope I've made that clear. On the question of refugee policy and the ideas in society, in a country which 70% of the press is owned by Rupert Murdoch, when both political parties have come to a similar view about asylum seekers, I think it to be no bad thing that alternative positions are put in small forums of the kind that I can organise.
G'day, I've got a math question for Glyn. How you going? That's cool. Yeah, cool. All right, I'll make it short and quick. Let's see. Given that 2/3 of people who go to university do vocational courses, that means it's 1/3 that don't do non-vocational courses. Is that right?
Roughly, yes.
Yep. Okay, cool. So, and you also said before that there's about 1 million people who go to uni, and about 300,000 of those are, on top of that, there's 300,000 international students, yeah? Yep,
if
cool.
you want to get precise, there's about 920,000 domestic students and just under 300,000 international.
Okay, so that's about 1.2 million, give or take. Okay, so if 2/3 of those, which is about 800,000 of those do vocational courses, what happens to the other 400,000 who don't do vocational courses? How is it possible to construct a model of universities without humanities when essentially you're leaving out, and a lot of those 400,000 are going to end up, in humanities, quite a majority of them, where is the place for them? Do they all end up in places like, Melbourne University or, you talk about, educational elitism and stuff like that. Well, if you're not given, these 400,000, majority of those 400,000 of those people places to actually go do these things, then you're actually sort of contributing to the culture of elitism, that is perceived, in certain universities by certain people. So can you comment on that?
Okay, well thank you. I'm not sure I would have bought your reading of what it was I said, but that's okay. There's about 400,000 students who are doing arts and science degrees across the country, and depends what you count in as non-professional. But just sort of back of the envelope, that sounds about right. And they're doing arts and science degrees at most Australian universities, though not every Australian university has those traditional courses. So there are plenty of places for those 400,000 people to get the education that they seek, and that's exactly as it should be. Nobody's advocating that they shouldn't have access to education. It's scary to look at what's happened in the United Kingdom, where the government has decided that if you want to do those basic courses, non-professional courses, you should pay 100% of the cost yourself, because there's no public benefit from people studying those courses. And that's a debate we've not had in this country, and we've been very fortunate not to have it. There's a general consensus that the community benefits from having doctors and nurses and lawyers, and it also benefits from having people who have basic education in arts and science, because they contribute to the community, they're part of the conversation, it's part of the democratic process, it's really important. Ray's made a number of times variations of a really important point, but elitism is about assuming that only people who go to university reflect on their lives and have something to contribute, a patently nonsense proposition. And for a long time in this country, 97% of people did not go to university, including most of our early prime ministers and so on. And clearly people lived rich, fulfilled and important lives where they made a substantial contribution. What's been important about recent decades is that for those who want to go to university, they're not locked out. There aren't impediments to getting to institutions. I have some sympathy for the view that not everybody should go to university or wants to go to university. You're not trying to drive toward a system of universal participation. It would just be pointless. It should be a personal choice. But for those who want to go to university, it should be easy to get there. And for those who want to study philosophy and the arts, there should be plenty of opportunities. I don't think it follows that to be a university, you must have philosophy and the arts.
I was just going to ask a question. As you mentioned, there's in universities are becoming increasingly specialised, and some may not have different departments. Do you think that this is a development that will continue, and we'll see universities to be separate universities for separate departments? And do you think that that is a positive or negative development?
Well, I think universities will always have to have separate departments because the tradition in the West has been that in very clear areas real progress has been made, and in those areas where progress has been made in understanding and knowledge, to some extent I think all universities have to mirror those disciplines. And And then as they've moved into qualifications and training, they also, if I need a podiatrist, I want the podiatrist to be trained in, not in general matters, but in feet. And so I can't see in the end that you can ever aspire to a kind of borderless community at a university, and I wouldn't be in favour of that at all.
If I may say, I think that trend to increasing specialisation is almost certain to characterise the next few decades, but it is worth noting that Australia is quite unusual. We have relatively few universities and they're relatively large. And Robert mentioned the diversity in the United States with liberal arts colleges, very small, focused, undergraduate only and so on. We have no institutions that in any way mirror those of any scale. And the interesting question is, will increasing diversity also provide a range of different sorts of institutions of different sizes and missions and so on? And that's less easy to predict.
Good evening.
I agree with you.
Sorry. After you. Oh, really? Oh, okay. Sorry, I just have a two-pronged question. First of all, did you consider including a student voice in the presentation tonight? And the second part of that is, do you see any merits in this forum in having that perspective?
We were invited rather than...
We didn't choose. Well, I was asked to chair this panel. I can start with that. I wasn't given a choice in who was on it.
But I mean, on the substantial question rather than the accusatory one, of course, the student opinion on these matters is intensely interesting to me. I mean, the one thing I won't be accused of is not taking students seriously, given that I have, with great dedication and interest, listened to students for 40 years and continued. This afternoon we were talking about an interesting film, so of course it's of interest what students think about what's going on, and I would be absolutely... I organise a thing called Ideas in Society, and the greater the number of students as a proportion of the audience, the happier I am, and so, of course, the whole purpose of being a teacher is to engage with and learn from and pass on and what you take to be valuable to a new generation and a new generation after that. So please don't believe that the fact that we're all old by your standards is a sign of being not interested.
And since I was the one who initiated, I should answer too. I mean, the panel is as it is because it started off with a lecture of mine, and because when Rob suggested that maybe we could have a public discussion and perhaps Glyn could be part of it, it really attracted me because Glyn, I'm not saying this because he's my Vice-Chancellor, is such an interesting Vice-Chancellor and has been so innovative and so on. And so it really mattered that we have someone who was at that level to be engaging with what we thought, and certainly with what I thought, because there was always the danger that it's pie in the sky sort of thing. And it was also important that there be some degree of common understanding, and so there would never have been people who were merely representative of this or that. And Rob and I have been thinking about these things together for 40 odd years, and it matters that we disagree. And I thought that could be, with Glyn and Rob and myself, it could be a very constructive agreement and disagreement. That's really why it was as it is. And it has to be relatively small, and I'm delighted that Margaret was invited to chair. But I would just say on my behalf exactly what Rob said of his. I would hate anybody to think that I don't take what my students think serious.
Thank you to the three of you. Many academics and scholars believed have claimed and still believe that the concept of university has its origin in Plato's academy. In other words, the whole notion of a university was invented by a philosopher. If that is the case, then how can you justify the rationale for diminishing the Department of Philosophy in universities, given the fact that a university is a creation of a philosopher?
Well, I don't think there is. I agree with Glyn, certainly this far. I don't think there's anything which is the concept of the university, and I suspect never has been. But I also think that the things that could rightly be called a university that were roughly consistent with the history of reflection that was about the university, the number is limited, and there was always argument about what would be included and what would be excluded. I have never thought of it as a Platonic form, which was essential, historically unchanging, and I've never thought of it as ever having existed in any place, so it was never a lot nostalgia for something lost. I've simply thought of it as a standard, or perhaps more accurately, a set of standards and ideals in whose light people who had a historically contingent form of intellectual life assess what they did. And what I found interesting about it was because it had a certain historical depth, and because it included as great exemplars people who were uncontroversially academics, if you like, if they were philosophers. And then there were people who were mavericks within the institution, and then, let's say in the case of philosophy, people who were never part of an institution, let's say like Socrates. And the reflection on when people said things like, is this consistent with the idea of a university? It was a historically deep form of reflection that could be unlimited. And what was interesting about the concept, I think, was it was a concept that enabled one to say, rightly or wrongly, it doesn't matter, but a concept that made sense of the proposition. An entire age has lost an understanding what it means to be in a university, or to be a university teacher, as opposed to a high-flying researcher in an institute of something or other. And therefore, the answer to these questions, what is it to be a university, what is it to be a university teacher, was never something that could be settled by a committee or by a dictionary, or by some group of people setting out to write a mission statement. And I think that concept has now gone for us, but of course it was a concept that hung together with other concepts. And one reason I said that maybe we could have a resurrection here, or believe in a resurrection, is because all that was anchored in a tradition of thought that was recorded, is in books and everywhere, which students still have access to. And that's why I said in my talk that our problem, in part, is to find what we can express in some authoritative, non-sentimental way about what we most treasure there, and can we still find conditions under which we can protect it? I think we can, but I think sometimes it means hard choices about expense. In the example I gave about research, for example, the conditions under which research would be less conformist than I think it's inclined to become.
A couple of responses, if I may.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No.
Of course, Rob and I are both political scientists, so we know it was Aristotle and not Plato who mattered, because Aristotle said politics are the master science. But if you're trying to understand the contemporary university, you look to its origins in European form in schools of theology rather than schools of philosophy. Although they deal with many of the same issues, you see the way law and other disciplines come out of theology, and that's the discipline that actually drives forward this. The invention of this form, which is now 1,000 years old. And if we showed a contemporary university to anyone back of the antecedents, they would presumably be puzzled and baffled that what is this stuff doing in this institution, and why is my core area not central? When Australia first debated setting up a university in Sydney in the 1840s, actually in the 1820s, the Anglican Church, then the established church, also it saw itself demanded in New South Wales that it structure the university and it be essentially like the UK universities, an institution that only practising Anglicans could attend, because that's the tradition that they came out of. And indeed that fight about whether universities were fundamental theological was fought out here in Melbourne. The dispute around the first legislation to set up the University of Melbourne was essentially a dispute about whether it was a religious institution or a secular institution. So I'm not sure we come out of a philosophical tradition. I think we actually come out of quite a different tradition, and much of the overlays of what we do, and even our architecture, which is of course ecclesiastical architecture traditionally, comes out of that tradition.
I mean, I want to kind of avoid the question and say something more general,
Well, this
which
will
is...
be the last word.
I know.
You have the last word.
Apparently, Ray told me that there were 15,000 responses to Wheeler Centre putting this on. If anything, what I think is shown is that there is an incredible interest in our society now. So many people have been to university, so many people over a very long period, so many people value what has happened to them, have criticisms of what is now happening or did happen in the past. I mean, my plea is that people here and others continue talking, because I think there are very few avenues now for public conversation about things that matter to us, and newspapers are not doing it much anymore, and there aren't many places like the Wheeler Centre which do it. So my kind of real hope is that the conversation about what happens at university, what's possible and what isn't possible, where it might go, where it might not go, does continue. And so I'm very grateful to the Wheeler Centre and for my three other panellists for participating in this event. And I do hope, when I said I was hopeful something would happen, I really meant it. And that's happening is conversation.
So thank you. Now, you'd have to say that such a discussion is perhaps its own conclusion, but I'd like, just before finally concluding, that we actually take this moment to really thank the speakers and you, the audience, for this wonderful discussion. And then I'm going to take the prerogative of chair to leave you with one quote. So the very clever spy master said at the end of his wonderful guide book, "As we have discussed, we have always tended to return to our own early days. Each of us sees it as it was when he was young. Each of us thinks his own age was by much the best. Each of us thinks that his successors ought to enjoy the things which he enjoyed and to admire what he admired. But why should they? Isn't it right that every generation should live its own life and worship its own gods?" Good night.